And welcome back, Professor Almeida, jpalmeida.com. Welcome to this lecture on developing critical thinking. This is a two-part lecture. It is the first in a series of lectures intended for my COSA 2 class at Long Beach City College, Critical Thinking Using Computers. So if this class interests you, or if you want to learn more about me, again, head on over to my site at jpalmeida.com. Now, as I've said, this is a two-part lecture, so if you need to pause this video at any time, please feel free to do so. So let's get started here, and we need to first define what critical thinking is. And a lot of times we get hung up on the critical part here because we think of criticism, being critical towards someone else, or even, movie or TV critics. What do movie critics do? Sometimes you'll hear them say, oh, I don't like the acting, or I don't like the storyline. Or when it comes to constructive criticism, we tend to get into this mindset and develop negative feelings. Oh my gosh, what's my boss going to say about my job performance? What's my professor going to think about my term paper? And we start to have those feelings. Well, when it comes to critical thinking, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's negative, right? We're taking a piece of information, we're looking at it, we're analyzing it, and we're coming up with our own conclusion. As a matter of fact, critical derives from the Greek word kritikos, which means to judge. So in essence, we're taking that piece of information, analyzing and interpreting it. We're drawing our own conclusions, drawing our own judgment, right? Does that make sense? So that's what it means to be critically thinking about something. Okay, so it's not necessarily negative. Now, there are some standards when it comes to critical thinking, and I want to share with you 3 things that you need to do to be a critical thinker. Number 1, critical thinkers recognize the value of having multiple points of view. What does this mean? Well, let's take, for example, the news. How many of us consume the news on a daily basis? Okay, I get my news from different places, right? I watch the news, I read the news. Imagine if you only got your news from one place. You turn on the TV to channel 9 and you just watched whatever they told you. Well, how do you know they don't have an agenda? How do you know you're getting the whole story? What are they not telling you? Are they trying to mess with your mind in some way? Speaking of trying to mess with your mind, Google the Zen TV experiment. It's an interesting activity, and as a matter of fact, for my COSA 2 class, that will be the first point of discussion. So again, the Zen TV experiment. But when it comes to the news, it's very important that you consider all points of view, even from those you disagree with. So when I get my news, for example, I get my news from Reuters, the Associated Press, France 24, BBC, the Huffington Post, Breitbart, InfoWars, yes, I went there, LA Times, WAPO, and even from the supposed fake news sources. Why? Because I don't want someone else telling me that I'm looking at fake news. I want to draw my own conclusion. And so if you want to be a good critical thinker, you're going to go to the sources that you don't necessarily agree with. You're going to take it all in, and you're going to draw your own conclusions. And sadly, we even see this on cable news. We have pundits who are doing all the thinking for us. They don't just give us the news. They're giving us their opinion. They're telling us how to think about the news. That's not a good thing. And when it comes to politics, right now we're living in a world of 2 dimensions, right? We have one dimension over here with their own set of beliefs and their own conclusions, and we have another dimension over there with their own beliefs and their own conclusions, and they're not willing to accept what the other side has to say. And especially on social media, those who are in control in one dimension, they're actually silencing those in the other dimension, whether it's through account suspensions or demonetization. So if you want to be a good critical thinker, you need to be able to straddle between the 2 dimensions or the 2 universes. And that even includes taking in things that you don't necessarily agree with, because you need to be able to draw your own conclusions and decide for yourself. So that's number one. Number two, critical thinkers remain open to continued learning. So as a student, you are learning about critical thinking in this class. You're learning how to college. And even when you are done with your career as a student, when you get into the workplace, well, now when you go to work for someone, you have to learn some skills on the fly. You have to learn their system. And even if you become really good at what you do, let's say you change employers, even though you're in the same line of work, now you have to learn their system. Here's another example. In technology, right? Technology is moving all the time, right? Technology moves quickly. We just had Office 2016 come out 2 years ago. We're already talking about Office 2019. When it comes to cybersecurity, things are always happening. I have industry certifications that I have to keep renewing. Matter of fact, I have to renew my Security Plus certification this year. So we're always learning. It never stops. And that is an important tenet of being a critical thinker, right? Number three, critical thinkers need to be willing to reconsider and change their mind. And it's 2018, it's election season. You're going to be seeing those politicians putting out ads on TV. He's a flip-flopper. Do you want him to be your mayor or senator or whoever? What if that person drew their own conclusions from something they read or heard about 5-10 years ago? What if there was a new revelation in that time that made them realize that maybe they were wrong and they changed their mind about it? There is nothing wrong with owning up to your old set of beliefs and being honest and open about what has happened since then. Maybe there was a new piece of information that caused you to change your mind. And there's nothing wrong with being a flip-flopper. Matter of fact, if you want to be a good critical thinker, again, be willing to reconsider and change your mind. So again, number one, recognize the value of multiple points of view. Number two, remain open to continue learning. Number three, be willing to reconsider and change your mind. So you're probably thinking either one of two things right now. Wow, this is really great stuff. And if you do think this is great stuff, feel free to hit that like and subscribe button. Or you think I'm full of it. And speaking of full of it, one of the other things you should be doing as a critical thinker is doing your own research. Don't just take someone's word for it, even mine, right? Remember what I said about getting your news from one source? Don't be afraid to go online, research key terms, research concepts. Don't just listen to me, right? Draw your own conclusions. So I'm going to tell you what the benefits are of critical thinking in the workplace and in life. And we already kind of used an example in life, right? When it comes to watching the news or doing ordinary mundane tasks such as watching TV, right? Believe it or not, if you do try the Zen TV experiment, hopefully it will change the way you think about watching TV. But again, we'll come back to the life part. Let's talk about the workplace. So at work, critical thinking will allow you to do your job better. What do I mean by that? Well, first, I want to share this with you. More than half of college grads don't find a job that utilizes their major. Matter of fact, I'm living proof of this. When I went to college, I got my degree in biology. Now, you're probably sitting here scratching your head going, oh, wait a minute. You have a degree in biology, but here you are teaching about computers and critical thinking. Well, eventually, I went back to school and I got my master's in educational technology. But not everyone has that luxury, right? How many people do you know in your periphery who went to college, they took on all that debt, they graduated, but they're working in Starbucks or somewhere that isn't even remotely related to what their major was? Okay, I'll bet a lot of you are probably nodding your heads or raising your hands right now. But even if you're working at Starbucks and you didn't major in coffee, right? Think about it. Most of your job skills are going to be taught on site anyway. your employer has a system. They have their own standard operating procedures that you're going to have to follow. And like I said, even if you are good at what you do and you change employers, they have their own SOP that you have to follow. And having the ability to adapt right away, to be able to solve problems, this is something that employers are more concerned about when they are hiring someone. They want someone who can reason efficiently and not just someone who's been taught a specific skill. Because again, we see this with automation. People with specific skill sets are getting replaced by robots. And those people who have honed those skill sets, they don't really have anything else, and they end up out of work, out of that profession. So you need to be able to become a good problem solver, to be able to reason efficiently. That's what employers are looking for. Now, in life, critical thinking helps us to avoid bad personal decisions. If everyone knew how exponents worked, if everyone knew about how compounding interest works, would there be bad loans? Think about it. Critical thinking helps us to make informed political decisions. Remember what I said about taking in all points of view and not just the views that you only agree with, right? The problem right now is we have two dimensions. Not many people straddle the universes. And as you've seen on social media, you've probably seen on social media, discourse is not exactly that great right now politically. Critical thinking helps us to attain personal enrichment. For many centuries, people thought that the world was flat, and those who suggested otherwise, at best they were ridiculed, at worst they were killed for those beliefs. So being able to critically think will allow you to make better decisions and understand the world around you more. And finally, critical thinking will help you to behave morally. Again, having a lack of critical thinking promoted centuries of oppressions. And sadly, in some societies, we still see that today because of the lack of critical thinking. So here are some essential questions you should ask yourself when it comes to being a critical thinker. What do I already know? What have I assumed? What questions can I ask? What does it mean? What is the evidence? And finally, what are my criteria? Now, on this last slide, I want to share with you the habits of mind. But before I do, I want to talk about what education experts have been saying over the years. For many years, experts in education always stressed the 3 R's. Have you heard of the 3 R's? Reading, writing, arithmetic. And sadly, we see some politicians who are jumping on education, saying we need to go back to the 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic. Well, does that necessarily equate to student success? Think about it. The problem with this metric of the 3 R's was that those who excelled in the 3 R's weren't necessarily the ones who succeeded. I have a powerful quote for you from Theodore Roosevelt. He once said that C students rule the world. Think about it. C students rule the world. What did he mean by that? What he meant was that the students who didn't bury themselves in books, who went out, they made connections, they learned as they went along, they were the ones who excelled at activities and not just having a 4.0 GPA or going to some prestigious college. I have another powerful quote here from Thomas Edison. Thomas Edison, okay, the creator of the light bulb. Thomas Edison once remarked, "I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work." What did he mean by that? A lot of times we are afraid to fail. And the most powerful teaching lesson that you could ever have in life is failure. And I know that's hard to swallow. Even for me personally, I've had my own failures. I've hit rock bottom. And there were times where I felt like this is the end of the world. I'm giving up. Okay? And I'm sure you have too at some point in your life. But even Thomas Edison once said, I have not failed. I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. Think about some of the other famous people throughout history who became successful not just because they were academically successful. Think about Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft. Albert Einstein, right? Albert Einstein. We all see him as a genius, but look into Albert Einstein's life. Was he successful academically? Okay, so in the face of mounting evidence, experts then accepted that student success is not just measured in milestones like, oh, this student here took geometry in high school and this student took a foreign language while they were in middle school. Student success was based on what were called the habits of mind. And two authors, or two experts, by the names of Arthur Costa and Benekalik, came up with a list of 16 of what they called the habits of mind. And I want to share some of that with you right here on this slide. So what are the habits of mind anyway? Well, intelligence is the sum of our habits of mind. It's how we use our mental habits to think and solve problems. Now, when you look through the habits of mind, you're going to see some similarities to what we just talked about, right? First of all, applying past knowledge to new situations. Remember what I said about failure as the great teacher here. If you know how you failed or you understand why you failed, you can take that past knowledge and apply it to where you are in life now so that you don't repeat those mistakes. Thinking independently and independently. Remaining open to continuous learning. Remember what I just said about being a critical thinker? Questioning and posing problems, taking intellectual risks, and sustaining intellectual curiosity. So again, feel free to look up the 16 habits of mind. So that's the end of part 1 on developing critical thinking. I hope that you have learned something new, and I hope that this video has helped. If you need to take a break, please feel free to do so. I know this video is kind of long. I'll be right here waiting for you, and we'll be right back with part 2. And welcome back. Welcome to part 2 on developing critical thinking. And in this lecture, I want to talk about the 5 obstacles to critical thinking. Okay, perceptual blocks, cultural blocks, intellectual blocks, emotional blocks, and polarizing blocks. Let's start with perceptual blocks. Perceptual blocks inhibit the ability to make sense of what we are seeing. There's a term out there called inattentional blindness. And there are numerous examples of inattentional blindness. For example, magicians use inattentional blindness to keep you from seeing their tricks, right? There's a video that you can watch on YouTube from the BBC where it was a card trick, and there was a magician and a participant, and they were going through the card trick, but you were so focused on the card trick that you didn't notice other things that were going on. And I won't spoil it. I'll leave it to you to do a search for that video, and you can watch it on your own. There is another video, and this was done as research. There was a video where you had to count the number of times basketballs were being passed around by those in a certain colored jersey, and you were so focused on counting the number of times the basketball was being passed around that you didn't notice something. And again, I'm not going to spoil it. Go find that video on YouTube. So again, these perceptual blocks interfere with thinking by blocking what we see. And sometimes we have a tendency to miss the details, especially when it comes to optical illusions. Now, there are many examples of optical illusions. I just described some when it comes to inattentional blindness, but also with Cubist art. Picasso had many different styles, and with some of his artwork, it was real easy to miss the details. For example, if you were to look at a painting, how many faces would you see on a painting? And if you had perceptual blocks, you might have missed the small little details, right? So optical illusions is a great example of this. So what's the best response to having a perceptual block? You need to learn how to look and how to notice, because sometimes the small details really matter. And when we get into critical thinking, in one of the OER textbooks, you're going to be analyzing a speech from President Obama, and you're going to take that speech apart and try to figure out the arguments, and again, you have to be able to draw your own conclusions to that. Let's talk about cultural blocks. Cultural blocks are derived from ingrained thinking or predispositions. And how we see the world is typically influenced by our cultural upbringings, right? And sometimes those cultural upbringings and the overall thinking of society can produce certain biases, right? And again, this also leads to things like having two dimensions or two universes, where perhaps you grew up in a strong Democratic family or in a strong Republican family, and you know, each side is in their own dimension and they refuse to consider other viewpoints, right? That's just an example of that. So what do you need to do? You need to learn to recognize some of the cultural blocks in your thinking, okay? Intellectual blocks. Intellectual blocks involve obstacles to knowledge. And a lot of times having the lack of knowledge leads to the lack of confidence. Think about it. If you weren't an expert in Microsoft Excel, right? You didn't know anything about spreadsheets, and you took my job and you had to stand in front of a classroom and give lessons on Microsoft Excel, not knowing how to use it, how would you feel about it, right? So the best response here is to acquire additional information and deepen understanding. It is often said that the best way to learn about a subject, maybe it's Microsoft Excel, the best way to learn it is to teach it. If you are forced to show someone how to get around in Microsoft Excel, if you are forced to do some of the exercises, if you're an educator and you're forced to do some of the exercises that you're giving your students, it's going to teach you what you thought you knew or what you didn't know, right? Emotional blocks. Emotional blocks occur when feelings inhibit our thinking. And one big emotional block is fear. The fear of being wrong. The fear of looking like a fool in front of everybody. I see it all the time in the classroom where I'll ask a question in class and I look out and I just see everyone just kind of sitting there, and they're kind of looking like, hey, who's going to raise their hand? They're going to raise their hand? Who's going to raise their hand? Or how about this? Maybe you're in a group. Hey guys, I need someone to volunteer. Is anyone willing to volunteer? What happens? Everybody starts looking at the other. Are you going to do it? You're going to do it? Are you going to do it? Are you going to do it? Nobody wants to raise their hand. Why? Because of fear. Fear and anxiety. But the biggest fear is the fear of being wrong. Now, I'm putting myself out there on YouTube right now. I have a worldwide audience. I know at some point someone's going to call me on my BS, right? Am I afraid of that? Well, I'm sure, admittedly, there's probably a little part of me that says, oh my gosh, what's the internet going to think about this lecture right now? You know, and there's really nothing wrong with that, but you just have to work to overcome that fear. One of the biggest things that you could do for yourself, and I've read this in a book, it's called Gorilla Mindset. I'm not getting paid to plug it. I read this book, it's called Gorilla Mindset. In this book, the first exercise is on self-talk, being able to stand in front of a mirror and start talking to yourself and to look at your expressions. What does that do for you? It starts to help you overcome the fear of how others see you, right? And once you get past that, you can become a lot more confident, especially when it comes to critical thinking. So right now, I have no problem staring into this camera, looking at you, and telling you all of this, right? So again, the best way to overcome this fear of being wrong, how people are going to perceive you, is to develop confidence, engage in that self-talk, record yourself, put out videos like this, and knowing that mistakes are part of your growth, right? We've talked about the fear of failure. We've talked about, the fear of being the person to get called on, or any volunteers, right? So again, know that mistakes are part of your intellectual growth. You can't learn unless you've gone through those experiences, you've failed, you know what not to do next time. That will help you to become a better critical thinker. So again, if you like what you see here, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. The last block is what are called polarizing blocks. This is the tale of two dimensions, dimension A, dimension B, right? The us versus them mentality. Coke versus Pepsi, Mac versus PC, right versus wrong, left versus right, black versus white. There's all these polarizing blocks, right? And it's the us versus them mentality. Thinking in terms of opposites. Categories that don't allow for compromise. Again, you see this in politics. We've talked about the two dimensions. And if you're going to be a critical thinker, you need to learn how to straddle between the two universes. Again, more examples of us versus them. Like I mentioned, black versus white, Coke versus Pepsi, hot versus cold, yes, no, win, lose, right, wrong. How do you overcome this? Search for the middle ground. Straddle between the two universes, right? That's what will allow you to become a better critical thinker. So I have a couple of key terms for you here from both parts of this lecture, and I'll leave them up here for you. Again, if you need to pause this video, please feel free to do so. So remember, that critical thinking is basically the process of analysis, reflection, and evaluation that leads to reasoned conclusions and judgment. So you are taking information, you're analyzing it, and you are coming up with your own interpretation and conclusion. Okay? Intelligence can be viewed as a sum of our habits of mind, how we use our mental habits to think and solve problems. We've talked about blocks, right? Perceptual blocks inhibiting our ability to make sense of what we're looking at when it comes to optical illusions. Intellectual blocks involving obstacles to our knowledge. So again, if you need to pause this, feel free to do so. Emotional blocks, when feelings inhibit our thinking. Polarizing blocks, right? Left versus right. We need to be able to straddle the universes. So I hope this video has helped you out. I hope I have convinced you to become a better critical thinker. Again, if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And that concludes this lecture, and we'll talk again soon. Thanks for watching.